Welcome back for week 2, part 2, the Shakers. If you hear faint wisps of bad top 40 music in the background, it's because I have the great good fortune of new neighbors who are the Brown women's crew team, and they've set up rowing machines in the driveway between the two properties, and it's a 24/7 gym now, and there's nothing to be done about it. So let's just hope that the soundtrack and the Shakers fit well together. The Shakers were a religious sect called the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. We never call them that anymore. We just call them the Shakers. They existed in America, and I want to include them in this class because there's a lot to learn from them, because I have found traditionally my students are really inspired by looking at their work, and because increasingly, especially with students coming from all over the world to America, most of my students have never heard of them. And so I'm hoping we can continue to keep them alive in the conversation, especially in design education. The Shakers endure today in our memory as furniture makers. As with all things, we sort of pick and choose what we want to remember when we put something in history and talk about it. And we have chosen an aspect of the Shakers to remember and sort of marginalize the rest. I think there's a lot to learn by looking at the bigger story, and I'm hoping I can help do that. Especially today, when so much of what we're doing is sort of being done without meaning, without care, without thought. Especially as we struggle to find ways to honor people who have different beliefs. Loving the Shakers, while also understanding where they were coming from, might help with that. The Shakers are known for their architecture, their crafts, their furniture. Everything they made exhibits clean economic lines and a really happy marriage of form and function. There are also lots of linguistic aphorisms and sayings that they left behind for us to use to understand them, and this is one of the best. Beauty rests on utility. I already talked about the relationship between form and function in the pre-industrial world of utility. The Shakers lived in this investigation in a really healthy way. They also said, do all your work as if you had 1,000 years to live, and as you would if you knew you must die tomorrow. So in all Shaker work, there's evidence of this effort to make timeless things that are outside of any contemporary pressures or interests. They're timeless, but they're also full of an urgency that their creation was an important tool to achieving something else. I think Shaker work is really rewarding to examine if you're looking for tiny little design details and decisions. If you just looked at any of this furniture from a distance, you would see a rectangle. And a lot of people think Shaker furniture is just plain rectangles. But take a look at the cabinet all the way on the right. If I took this off the screen and said, now draw it, you would just draw a rectangle. But if you examine it, there are 2 doors in the middle of the cabinet, and that's already dividing the cabinet visually into either 3 parts, side and door, or 4 equal parts, side, 2 door panels inside. Vertically, it's dividing this cabinet into either 2 pieces, 2 cabinet doors, or 4 pieces, 2 cabinet doors divided in 2. But then if you look at where the knobs are placed, they're dividing the cabinet into 3 equal parts. So you could say rectangle with sub-rectangles, but if you start to examine the decisions, it's like arrhythmic music or multi-rhythmic music. There are all of these quiet, not discordant, but sort of different ideas about division, about arrangement. The cabinet to the left of that is 3 zones: upper door, middle drawers, lower door. The doors line up, again, sort of creating a vertical visual, but then there's no logic with the drawers at all. There's a big drawer at the top, below that 3 drawers, 1 on the left, 2 on the right, but they're not divided down the middle of the cabinet. So anything you look at that the Shakers made on first glance would seem simple, or even simplistic. There's a difference between those 2 words. But when you start to examine it, they are rich with complexities. Shaker furniture was created with a focus on function. Their work was a doorway into spiritual fulfillment. And as a result, their designs are like textbook examples of functional purity, of rational form, of material integrity, of things we were struggling with in design in the 1950s and 60s. And they were doing it in 1800, 1810, 1840. The Shakers felt that making something well was in itself an act of prayer. I'm not a person of faith, so whenever I meet someone who has faith, I'm really envious of the sort of doorway to fulfillment that it gives people. The Shakers are a great example of something I can understand a little bit better with my own faith compass, which is when they did stuff with their hands, they were praying. And I suspect that all my students understand this already. Like, if you're in a bad mood, you could eat ice cream, you could, punch something hard. There's lots of ways to get in a better mood. But for most of us in the art and design world, making something is a relief valve. So if I start folding paper or hitting metal or doing something productive with my hands, I instantly attain a sort of spiritual fulfillment. That was a core belief of the Shakers, and I think it's something that all art and design students can understand. For the Shakers, work was a path to spiritual fulfillment. Being productive was a way to sort of get closer to heaven. As a result, they produced more than they consumed, so they had extra, and they sold that to the outside world. They were really inventive in the ways they marketed the things they had in abundance to other people. They were the first people to sell packaged seeds, so they sort of thought of the concept of selling seeds. They were really good farmers. They had lots of seeds. They also grew things that the rest of America didn't know about. So they were providing seeds to people to increase the food output of the nation. They also realized if they were selling things that people were unfamiliar with growing, they needed to come with instructions. So these beautiful seed packets, which were made with the die at the top, you strike the paper and you cut your strip of paper into envelope blanks, and you could print those with the instructions. So I think they're beautiful aesthetically, but they're even more beautiful conceptually. The concept of packaging and selling seeds, the way the envelope was executed, it's a complete system. They started selling seeds in 1794, and by 1805, they were selling 7 tons of seeds a year from one community alone, from New Lebanon alone. That's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. In addition to seeds, the Shakers sold apples, canned food, herbs, honey, candies. They wound up contracting out their label printing. So there are a few different generations of labels, and I don't know enough about it, but I know they had a printer, I think in Chicago, printing a lot of their labels, and there are a few different graphic styles associated with what they did. All of them I find to be quite beautiful. They also were at one point the largest producer of medicinal herbs in the United States. In the 1850s, the community in Canterbury, New Hampshire, made over $3,000 in profits. That's over $60,000 today, just from selling medicinal herbs. And you can see in this slide, those were sometimes liquids or tinctures. They were sometimes compressed solid that you could shave parts off of, and they had presses and labeling systems for that as well. Shaker work shows a beautiful understanding of material as a way to arrive at form. If you're looking for that relationship between what something's made of and what it should look like, Shaker work will really reward you. As a result, their work is not stylistically created. It's not created to make a visual style. It's created to explore what it needs to be to function for its utility and also for the materials it's made out of. The Shaker box, one of the things the Shakers are most known for, isn't something they invented, but it is something they perfected. The Shakers turned that box into the most refined version of what it could be. They introduced the fingers, which spread out the wood movement, so as that wide piece of wood moves, it's not going to crack. They also give extra real estate for the rivets, which are nail heads that have been used as rivets. And they redesigned the sizes so that they could nest, so you could sell a whole set of them. On the lower right, you can see the template that was used to mark and cut the fingers. And if you paid attention to one of the earlier lectures, you'll notice what those little holes in the upper right-hand side are. Those are reference points. So you'll always position your fingers correctly on all of the boxes you make. And on the lower right are some wooden forms with metal plates around which the wood could be bent and then the rivets could be secured. Between 1822 and 1865, so in just about 40 years, the New Lebanon community alone sold over 77,000 boxes. But there's a lot more to this equation than just the pretty things the Shakers made. I want to look a little bit about who they were and why they existed to help explain not only the sort of spiritual fulfillment part of this, but also just the bigger context of where this stuff came from. The community started with a woman named Anne Lee who lived in England. She lost 4 children in a row, and you can imagine that after she lost her 4th child, she might be looking around for something to explain our time on this planet in a more meaningful way. She had grown up Quaker, and she had a vision from God that helped her realize that sex was the problem. You lose 4 children because you've had sex. So celibacy was a really fundamental part of her solution to this problem, and she founded the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearance in 1770. She believed that Christ's second coming would be in the form of a woman. You can understand that the world might be challenged by that idea at the time, or even now. And from 1770 on, her crew believed that she was that incarnation. So she was persecuted, she was imprisoned in England. She had a vision in 1772 of a blazing tree that alerted her to a better path in America. And in 1774, with 8 followers, she relocated to upstate New York, just outside Albany. And in 1787, the first community was built in New Lebanon, New York. The Shakers became one of the most successful utopian communities ever, certainly the most successful in America. Their governing principles included celibacy, no sex, and agrarian communal living, living off the land, farming, and living and working as a community. Religion for the Shakers was a lifestyle. It wasn't just a thing that happened on Sunday morning and then you put it behind you. All day, every day, everything you did was part of an expression of faith. They also lived segregated by gender. So the picture on the upper right is a dormitory. Men lived on one side, women on the other, a wall dividing the 2 halves of the building. But all of the work and prayer happened communally. The Shakers had a really unusual belief that God was not gendered. God was both male and female, or above male and female, somehow transcending the idea of a gender divide. That is a radical idea. Even in today's world, that's an idea that if you said it out loud would probably get you killed on much of the planet. As a result of this, though, the Shakers believed that men's work and women's work, although perhaps different based on physical abilities, was equal. Women's work was not lesser. That's a radical idea that, frankly, 200 years later, we're still struggling to make our reality. The Shakers said, put your hands to work and your hearts to God. So again, it is by being active with your hands that you attain a spiritual fulfillment. All of their interiors show this really wonderful mixture of practicality and spirituality, of daily life and of prayer. The picture on the left is a sewing room, and it has small benches to lift your feet up so that your knees are always at the right position for sewing on your lap. There are all sorts of wonderful practical details in a Shaker interior that are rewarding to examine. We focus so much on the utility and innovation in Shaker design that we forget about the spiritual level. The Shaker peg is one of the greatest things ever. In a New England home, there's a chair rail that keeps your chairs from hitting the wall. In a Shaker building, there's a peg rail way up high with evenly spaced standardized pegs, and then everything they made for their interiors honored that standardization. So you could use those pegs to hang all sorts of things. Your clothing on hangers, tools like shovels, a shaving mirror, a clock, your blanket. Imagine how great that is, that your room has decor on the back wall, and then if you're cold at night, your blanket's right there behind you. You could have a towel rack that hung on those pegs, and you could even hang your furniture. Why would you want to hang chairs on a peg? Think about it. You want one chair in your room for everyday use, but you need an extra chair if someone comes over. If you're a neat freak and want to really clean the floor, which the Shakers were, you could hang up all the furniture and really get in there and clean. But even better, you want a dance party? Hang those chairs on the wall and get the fiddle out and let's go. But it's the standardization of the peg shape and spacing in all of their buildings that allowed this to work as a system across every piece of architecture. At their peak, there were between 4,000 and 5,000 members. There were 18 communities stretched out over almost 1,000 linear miles. They went through New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. The largest community was about 300 people, but their numbers dwindled in the 20th century. And when I ask my students why, the first thing they say is, well, that celibacy thing, right? Like no sex, no children. Certainly you get no more dead children, but you also get no future. And that's true. But the bigger reason they died out is industrialization. When the Shakers started, life out in the world was really difficult. And living communally made farming easier, made all of the tasks of being alive on this planet much simpler. Scale them up, and you have more work, but you can build efficiencies into everything. Once industrialization arrived and people could purchase more things and not have to do them all themselves, life in the outside world got a little bit easier. So the lure of communal living was less compelling. In their heyday, Shakers would take in anybody who wanted to join them. And there was a thing called the winter shaker, someone who just didn't want to make it through winter, who said, yeah, I want to join you. And then come spring, off they went. But there were also a lot of children left with the shakers, because if you had 8 children and you could only feed 6, you had to find some way for those others to survive, and leaving them with the shakers was a really healthy guarantee that they would have a childhood where they were educated and fed and learned skills. So a lot of children were left with the shakers. But the US government got a little bit worried about the shakers because they were producing so much of our medicinal herbs and our food. The government passed legislation that religious institutions could not adopt children. So a family could, but a group of people couldn't. As a result, it became more difficult for the shakers to take in children from the outside. So a whole bunch of different reasons sort of piled on together to begin whittling down the numbers of shakers. But the biggest one was industrialization, that life just got easier everywhere else. Some of the shaker campuses are now museums, and if you ever have the opportunity to go to one, you should. It feels holy. It feels like a religious experience to go and see these places. There's just enough evidence of what it was like to be there left in the buildings and the landscape that you can really appreciate it. Hancock Village near Pittsfield, Mass. was one of the last communities to go, and it is a museum today. This slide shows the round barn at Hancock Village, and it is a beautiful example of architecture as a system. It's a round stone building. The backside has an earthen ramp up to it, so carts full of hay could drive in at the second floor level. There's a driveway around the inside of the building as a balcony, so those carts could go in and drive around, unload the hay, and continue right back out without having to turn around. They unload the hay into a column in the middle that goes up all 2 stories. In the middle of that column is a vent shaft that goes out the roof, and that was to keep the hay ventilated so it wouldn't start composting and then combust. And then the bottom layer, you enter from the front of the building, and that's where the cattle would go in and walk around to an available stall and feed from the hay. The floor is slats, so as the cow leaves things behind, that falls through and can be harvested for fertilizer. So the whole building enables this system of feeding a cow to happen in a really graceful way. On the lower right is an illustration from Eric Sloan. If you like anything about the era of doing things by hand, Eric Sloan's books are rich in resources of what the tools were like, what they looked like, and how they were used. All of this valuing the spiritual aspect of working by hand does not mean that the shakers weren't also interested in technology. They were interested in doing what they were doing as well as possible, and when technology helped, they embraced it. There's a picture on the right of the still existing water turbine that was purchased in Boston to install at the Hancock Village wood shop in 1858. It replaced the water wheel. So the drawing on the lower left, you can see the wood shop is on a slope, and there had been a stream that went past and powered their 1 horsepower water wheel. When they bought the turbine, they moved that stream to be an underground pipe that went right under the building and through the turbine. So in the morning, they would open up the turbine, the water flows through it, it spins, it transfers its power to the belts, which power all of the equipment, giving them 3.5 horsepower instead of 1. In 1872, in that wood shop, the shakers were able to make 24 chairs a day with 10 workers. That's a really big output for chairs that are essentially handmade. In 1884, they made 3,000 chairs in that shop. So this was really big business, and power was essential to make that happen. The shakers were champion-class problem solvers, and that's another reason I think industrial design students need to know about them. What seems to us now like a really crude tool, this table saw, was really very forward-thinking. This is a shaker innovation that goes way back, so anytime I use a table saw, I thank them for bringing it into my life. The invention story is a little bit clouded in mystery. The story goes that a woman named Tabitha Babbitt at Harvard, Massachusetts in 1813 watched the men sawing wood, and there's another Eric Sloan illustration in the upper left to show you a bench saw or pit saw. So usually there'd be a pit for the lower man to stand in, put the wood on a frame, and then the lower man pushes the saw up and the upper man guides it as they drop it, and they do that over and over, but it only cuts in one direction. So half of that labor, which is the pushing up, the hard part, is extra. And Tabitha Babbitt, coming from the woman's sphere of shaker work, was familiar with spinning wheels and yarn winders and rotational movement. And she realized if you could put the teeth of the saw on something rotational, you could just keep cutting in one direction and get rid of all that extra effort. The problem with that story, and I believe it, I believe all of that happened, and I also want to believe that a brilliant woman made that cross-pollination idea and gave me the table saw. The problem is the shakers were actually advertising circular saw blades as early as 1792. It doesn't matter. Either way, the circular saw came out of the shaker community and has, I hope you agree, transformed our world. But there's all sorts of other things in our world today that came from the shakers as well. Things they invented and things that they improved. We had made nails for a very long time by forging, by hammering metal. And the shakers advanced that and introduced the cut wire nail. Take a piece of wire, cut it, and then form the head. They also either introduced or perfected clothespins. Their earlier ones are two pieces of wood bound together, and their later ones are cut and formed out of one piece of wood. Remember, because they lived communally, their problems were magnified, and anything that would help speed up something they were doing would be welcome. So a lot of their innovation was focused on finding ways to work in bulk, repetitive tasks. Apple peelers get their own slide because I don't think most of us have ever seen one. They're not really in our day-to-day world anymore. They're in industrial kitchens. But imagine if you're going to make apple something, applesauce, apple pie, apple anything for 300 people, and you have to peel them all. So this idea of reconfiguring the work so that the apple spins and the blade stays in one place would have been a really big time saver. Also, this idea of cross-pollinating from different spheres of work is really evident in shaker stuff. And I believe that's because of this valuing of men and women's work equally. It allowed cross-pollination. Le Corbusier, famous architect in the 1920s, had to bring in someone else to think about designing interiors and kitchens because he didn't have any idea how a kitchen worked. That's for women. He wasn't interested in that. The shakers did all sorts of great learning from what worked in a kitchen and let that work somewhere else. The butter churn on the upper left is on a rocker, so you just tap it with your foot while you're doing something else. And that idea is taken right out of the nursery from a baby's rocker. Some of the shaker innovations are mechanical in nature and still in evidence in our world. They had a really refined way of using basic mechanisms to maximize what they could accomplish. But some of the shaker innovations are really just improvements on things that had existed for a long time, but benefited from re-examination. The chair on the lower left is a cobbler's bench, which has a place for the cobbler to sit while he's working on shoes, and it's such an unusual form. I've only seen this in shaker villages, but I love evidence that every task deserved its own sort of examination and support devices. Some of the shaker innovations are really small, but really useful. I have a friend who always needs the end of her bed lifted or lowered a little bit. So we put the brick under it, we take the brick out from under it. This is a bed with a cam at the end, so you can turn the cam and raise one end or the other end and adjust the bed that way. And it's in the infirmary, so there must have been some reason people needed elevated feet. But I think that's just such a wonderful, tiny little addition to a bed, a self-raising foot. And although the shakers were essentially agrarian farmers, they were unafraid of charging into the future. This is a patent and an illustration and a model for a wheel-driven, steam-powered washing machine. Way back in 1858, a steam-powered, wheel-driven washing machine. Because imagine you have a laundry basket with 300 people's laundry in it, you're going to want a way to do it faster. The laundry room at Hancock Shaker Village is so beautiful. Also, there are patents by many shakers because they were interested in the patent system for exactly the reasons the patent system was created, to help share innovation and improve quality of life. Many of their innovations really stand up to scrutiny and have a lot to offer to today's designer. This is the button tilt joint, patented in 1852, and this is a great example of design for behavior. George Donnell realized that everyone was tipping back in their chairs, which damages the floor, which is likely to split out the grain on the leg of the chair, and which will ultimately, oftentimes, send the chair sitter flying backwards. And he thought, well, there's no point telling everyone to not do this. Clearly, this is what people want to do in a chair. Let's redesign the chair. So he introduced a rotating ball that sets up into a socket of the foot and is held in place with a leather strap. So when you tip back, the chair stays flat on the ground. The design of the chair allows the behavior to happen. That's something we didn't start really intentionally doing in industrial design until a good 100 years later. Their innovations are also useful studies for designers because they so clearly link form with utility. Nothing's decorated, and yet there's true beauty in almost everything the shakers produced. It took the rest of the post-industrial world another 100 years to catch up with some of the innovations that the shakers introduced. On the left are flat brooms. The world for centuries had made bundled round brooms, a bundle of sticks or twigs or branches that were round. That's what the world used as a broom. But if you're a neat freak, you know that a round broom in a rectangular room is going to leave you dust bunnies in the corner. If you have a flat broom, you can get into the corners. So they revolutionized broom making and introduced flat brooms. Also, the picture on the right is 2 shovels. The one on the left is for grain, so it has sides, and it's quite large, so you can pick up a lot of grain because grain doesn't weigh all that much. The shovel on the right is for snow. It's a flatbed with a metal edge and an angled handle so that you don't have to bend over as far, so you can use your back muscles better for lifting the very heavy snow. We're not going to see anyone else that I know of think about changing the shovel to suit the work until the 19-teens and 20s in the steel industry in Pittsburgh. The Shakers were onto this idea 100 years earlier. Not only that, they designed the sidewalk as a system. So the sidewalk is the width of the shovel. And I think of this every time I shovel. I have a 2.5 width sidewalk, and it's long. And every time I shovel in the winter, I have to go 2 times, and I have just enough for half another shovel width. And I feel like I am wasting so much energy doing this if only I had a slightly wider shovel or a slightly narrower sidewalk. The Shakers designed this as a system. The Shakers wrote, "Do not make something unless it is both necessary and useful. But if it is both, do not hesitate to make it beautiful." They weren't against the idea of making things beautiful or making things decorated, but it had to work in concert with the original conceptual utility of the object. They also believed that since God provides us with all the gifts of natural resources, like God made the tree, so if I cut the tree down and use the wood for something, there is God in that wood, and the things I make with it have to be holy. They have to honor that source. This is a logic that can be found in so many cultures, Native American cultures, any culture that really honors the land it lives on. And I think we've pretty much forgotten that now. So this is a dimension of the Shakers that I really admire and would like to keep alive in my own thinking. Also, it forced them into a life of thrift. You're not going to waste the wood. You're going to make the thing you were making out of the wood, and then all the scraps get used for something else because there's God in the wood scraps. So you're not going to throw it away. You're going to find some way to honor that. The image all the way on the right is a tailor's measure. It's a ruler for making clothing. And I put it in because I'm really intrigued by it. The right-hand edge is a straight edge with numbers. The left-hand edge is curved to do sleeves or I don't know what. I'm not a tailor. And it has numbers on the other side. So this is a ruler that produces a straight edge and straight measure, a curved edge and curved measure, all in one wooden object. It has a hole and a cord to hang on your shaker peg. And you all don't know me well enough to know that I'm obsessed with charts. I love looking at charts. I don't even care if I know what they're for. The Shakers were champion class information graphics producers, and that's another part of their output that we've sort of forgotten and I think we should look at more. This is a really humble plan. This is how to stand in church during worship. 1824. They had a square worship space, and probably for years they were trying to figure out how to get more people in there. How can everybody see and get in and out and fit best? And someone came up with the ultimate plan, which is 4 entry points. The worship service happens in the middle, and you're maximizing the number of people who are equidistant from it. It's a great plan. And because there were multiple communities, they committed this to paper and sent it to everyone else, right? Like, hey, you guys are probably struggling with this too. We figured it out. Here you go. The document on the left is a chart of the visionary dance from 1853. And on the right is an image by an outsider done in the 1870s just to show you what that looked like. And I love this chart on the left because it shows you not only what the words to the song are and what the melody of the song is, but how to perform the dance to that song. That's a lot of information in one document. And that sort of tips into another huge category of Shaker output that's not part of this talk. This unfortunately doesn't relate to industrial design as much as I'd like it to, although I'm sure you could make it if you wanted to. And I do. But the Shakers produced a lot of music. They had the ability to find and give voice to inner light. So part of their religious existence, part of their spiritual fulfillment, was uniting all of the different aspects of life, which included music and dance and faith and prayer. Most Shaker music, and there are thousands of songs, is still unknown to us today. The one exception is Simple Gifts, and that is known to us today mostly because although it was written in 1848, it was repurposed by Aaron Copland in 1944 as the main melodic structure to Appalachian Spring, which he wrote for Martha Graham's ballet. So it is something that we know of as part of American history, comes from the Shakers. Also, between 1820 and 1900, the Shakers developed their own form of music notation that they called the letteral system, where alphabet letters were used to indicate pitches. The chart on the left is the Holy City from 1843. One of the reasons the Shakers have so many beautiful information graphics is an important part of their belief system was the idea of a spirit visiting you in your sleep, in a trance, in a dream state, and giving you information. This is Adam. You remember him from the Bible, that dude from Eden. He came down to Earth in 1843 on March 16th and offered a map of the Holy City to the believers. And these are called gift drawings. A spirit gave the information to somebody, they produced a gift drawing, a record of that visitation. So this is a plan of the Holy City, which of course would help you on Earth. The drawing on the right is what New Lebanon looked like here on our Earth. If you could build your earthly environment to prepare you for your heavenly existence, you might have a better time when you get there. If you know where things are located in heaven, you can locate them in a similar way on Earth. But I really love the chart on the left because, again, as I mentioned with the Shaker furniture, it is a crazy sort of cacophony of minor conflicts that present themselves on the surface as symmetry. Was that the longest sentence I ever crafted? Maybe. From a distance, it's a circle with a square inside with some other smaller circles. But the more you look, the more it offers you. There's symmetry on every axis. There's lateral symmetry. There's linear symmetry. There's rotational symmetry. And at the same time, there's no symmetry. It's crazy, wonderful imbalance. Many of their gift drawings are elaborate narratives, and the title of them tells you what they're about. I could look at some of these for hours and still have no real clue what they are, but they're definitely a narrative of some kind. I know the one on the right is the heavenly sphere, so it has all the people you're probably going to encounter there and all of the vegetation, all the trees you'll meet. There's a whole wide range of what these look like, and some of them are unbelievably abstract. This is an information graphic, a gift drawing from 1840. The rest of the world didn't produce anything like that in 1840. If you're interested in these, and I hope you are, there's a wonderful website, ubu.com, set up by Kenneth Goldsmith. And the section on ethnopoetics, how different cultures record their beliefs, is put together by Jerome Rothenberg, and it's really, really satisfying to look through. I love comparing this 1840 Shaker spirit message with Cy Twombly, because to me they have exactly the same sort of, I'm, as an artist, as a creator, connecting with some spiritual message, either invented by me or handed off to me by Adam from the Garden of Eden, whatever. But it's making its way onto paper with this energy and excitement that's sort of undeniable. This drawing, The Narrow Path to Zion, made by Emily Babcock, was originally one long scroll, 8.5 feet long. These are the separate segments of it. And it shows the walking of the narrow path to Zion, to heaven. So at the end there you see a high wall, a big brick or stone wall with angels above it. And that's where you're trying to get to heaven. But all of these things along the way are the mortifications of life on earth, are the obstacles you'll face. So all of these things are coming at you to prevent you from getting there, and eventually you'll get there. And I love this drawing, I mean, for 1,000 reasons, but mostly because to me, it just looks like Super Mario Brothers, like do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do, right? And then eventually, I don't know what happens at the end of Super Mario Brothers. Do you save a princess or something? For the Shakers to get to heaven. This is a video game. It's a narrative, right? It's an experience. So anyone who thinks that experience design and systems design is new with websites, you're so wrong. Also, I don't know what that little airplane crop dusting is doing in there because there were no airplanes in 1843. So you might rightfully be wondering, like, what is the legacy of the Shakers? Did they all just die out and go? And every time I talk about the Shakers, someone loves to say, you know, there's still 2 of them left, as if somehow that's a meaningful statement. But it's true. There were 3 left at the last functioning Shaker community, which was part where they lived and part museum at Sabbath Day Lake. Sister Frances Carr, I think, was the last of the Shakers because she was left as an orphan with the Shakers in 1938 and lived there her whole life. She died in 2017 at the age of 89, leaving 2 more Shakers. Arnold Had, who joined in 1979 in his 20s, and Sister June Carpenter, who joined in 1995 at the age of 50. So again, a lot of people say, look at this failure of the Shakers, they've died out, but that's 230 years later. They made beautiful things. To us, we use the beautiful things they made as a placeholder for simpler times. Like you can go to Hancock Shaker Village and look at the wonderful, simple lifestyle of the Shakers. That really robs them of their, well, everything, right? Like it wasn't simpler times. I think it was much more difficult times. The labor involved in surviving on this planet was really difficult. And they managed to do that in a really interesting, utopian way. And I have to wonder, was utopianism and the desire to counter the increasing industrialization and globalization that was happening at that time so unique to them? All the changes that I talked about in the last talk with the American system of manufacturing and gun making and clock making and figuring out systems for manufacturing was changing the world. Their desire to counter that, I think, has a lot to teach us today as our world is changing and we're trying to figure out how to reconcile that. So I think it's a safe way to remember them. They made pretty things. But I think it robs us of the understanding of how pretty things can also be useful things and world-changing things and discursive things that are commentaries on what's happening. Also, their rational approach to creating things has remained hugely influential. So although they may be gone and the world they were reacting to may be gone, the footprint of what they did is still evident in our world. A couple of quick examples. Hans Wehne, famous Danish designer, is often used as an example of what makes Danish design identifiable and great. His work owes a huge debt to the Shakers. In fact, one of his chairs is called the Shaker chair. And you could discuss George Nakashima's work, made in Pennsylvania, as something that is honoring a sort of Japanese sensibility of honoring nature and reduced parts. You could look at it as honoring the materials it's made of, letting the wood be wood. But you can certainly also see the influence of Shaker work and aesthetics and thinking in his work. But I want to try and also remember the Shakers for the crazy faith part of what they did. Other people's faith always seems weird to us. That's one of the problems in the world, right? We don't have a lot of tolerance for people who don't believe what we believe. And so I get why we might prefer to remember the pretty chair and forget the sort of disturbing, unknowable gift drawings. But I think in today's confusing times, when there is so much attention focused on other people, other faiths, other countries, I like forcing myself to remember that it's only because of their faith that the Shakers were able to arrive at such enduring beauty. And I think to separate object from belief is kind of wrong. So I don't know, write me off as an optimist who grew up in the early 70s, but I kind of think that learning more about people's beliefs, about the Shakers' beliefs, allows us to understand the beauty of the object. And it's a door into a more complete way of remembering not just the Shakers, but maybe also building those muscles we need to be more tolerant of each other. That sounds impossibly optimistic. Could I really believe that? I do. Okay, so that's the Shakers. That's part 2, week 2. There's one more part, week 2, which is Josiah Wedgwood, coming up. I'm gonna end with this video and a link to it so you can watch the whole thing on making a Shaker box, because for my students especially, it's a real satisfaction to watch. All right, thanks. I have to take a break and cool down because it's hot with all the windows closed because your neighbors have a gym in the driveway. Okay. I didn't move my feet once. I was so afraid of stepping off the green, I never moved my feet.